Okay, let's talk about one of the subjects I find fascinating about the field of IO psychology, individual differences. You know, one of the reasons I even became an IO psychologist was that I have always loved being a people watcher. I remember that when I was still in my clubbing days, a long time ago, I would go out with my friends, and instead of being on the dance floor all night, I'd love to just sit and watch everyone around me. What strange behaviors you get to observe when people are intoxicated and in a club setting. Of course, let it be known that I was never one of those people who was intoxicated and acting strangely. At least none of you guys can prove it. At any rate, by the end of today's lecture, I'd like for you guys to be able to define individual differences and assumptions underlying this approach, to be able to define G and discuss how it relates to job performance. I'd also like for you to be able to describe the big five dimensions of personality and describe their relation to work performance. And finally, I want us to take a look and have you be able to define vocational interests and discuss why they should be studied in the field of IO psychology. But first, you should know me by now. Let me start off by asking you a question. Take a look at the people on this screen. In case you forgot, I'm the person on the bottom right-hand side. What do all of these people have in common? I'll let you think about that for a second. Okay, well, I hope that you're thinking not much, right? We all have different abilities, experiences, interests, personalities, different ages, different genders, different races, and education. Unfortunately, one of the people on the screen is no longer even alive. Well, IO psychologists believe that all the ways that people are different, whether it's intelligence, personality, physical abilities, interests, etc., can predict behavior, especially job performance. When we're talking about individual differences, we're talking about a lot of different things. Specifically, we're talking about the dissimilarities among two or more people. And there are a lot of things that can be included in this definition. These include things like cognitive ability, physical ability, personality, and interests, all things that we're going to talk about today. These differences can lead to various kinds of behaviors in an organization, for example, performance, but can also lead to an organization's climate, interpersonal relations, and whether or not people identify with their organization, other things that we are also very interested in looking at as IO psychologists. So who are the people involved in examining and using these individual differences? Well, let's take a look. Well, first there's a differential psychologist. So before we became interested in measuring cognitive ability to predict job performance, there were some people who were called differential psychologists who went out and discovered individual differences. There are also people who we call psychometricians, and they're the ones who go out and measure all of these different individual differences. So they're finding ways to measure cognitive ability, finding ways to measure personality, and finding ways to measure interests. Then there are applied IO psychologists. They're using the individual differences to predict work behavior, and they're using that on the job. We can use the metaphor of mining to examine these different people. So if you use a mining metaphor, the differential psychologist is the person who surveys the land and looks for places to drill. They're the ones who are looking for ways that people are different and interested in whether or not the ways that these individual differences might predict important outcomes like performance on the job. Psychometricians, on the other hand, are the ones that are sinking the mining shafts. So they're the ones who are actually coming up with the ways to measure those individual differences. Finally, the applied IO psychologist is using what comes out. In other words, if the differential psychologist and psychometrician find that some individual differences predict performance, the applied IO psychologist is going to implement that information in the workplace and make it happen. Now, looking at our history with individual differences, there used to be a real heavy emphasis on only looking at intelligence. Using our metaphor, the psychologists at this time were only sinking their mining shafts in one place. This focus on only looking at intelligence was called the geocentric model. Today we understand that there are a variety of individual differences out there way beyond intelligence that are also useful for predicting work behaviors. So we're also interested in sinking our shafts into the land of individual differences and looking at other things like emotions, values, personality, and interests. But keep in mind a few things when it comes to individual differences. First, no single individual difference will completely explain work behavior, so we're not going to only measure a person's intelligence. We also want to look at other things like personality, like their values, or like their interests. Second, you can't separate individual differences from each other. So one's intelligence is intimately tied with one's personality, and those relations are important when it comes to predicting performance and other important outcomes in the field of IO psychology. Finally, not all individual differences will be important. So in IO psychology, we know that some constructs, while they used to be looked at, are not really important and don't seem to do a good job of predicting things in our field. For example, handwriting analysis or graphology. We're not interested in that. Some people have been interested in emotional intelligence or EQ, but many IO psychologists don't think that these things are helpful at this point. There are many facets of performance, so let's take a look at the kinds of individual differences that are necessary for predicting work performance. Let's start on the job side. Imagine we have a firefighter who is asking us the question that you see before you. And the firefighter is asking, what are the tasks that I do in my job as a firefighter? Well, you might be thinking of things like the following. They might provide medical assistance. They might learn new procedures. Obviously, they're going to be putting out fires if they're good firefighters. They'll be working in teams. They'll be rescuing people, but hopefully they'll also know how to drive that fire truck and not crash into other fire trucks like we just recently saw in Houston. Well, let me ask you a question. What does it take to do things like provide medical assistance and learn new procedures? Think about that for a second. The answer to that is it takes cognitive ability. On the other hand, what does it take to rescue people and put out fires? It takes physical ability to rescue people and put out fires. What does it take to work in teams? It takes interpersonal communication skills. Finally, what does it take to drive that fire truck? Well, it takes things like vision, obviously, coordination, and memory. If you didn't have the memory, how would you know how to get to the places that you need to get to put those fires out, right, gang? Well, cognitive ability is only related to learning new procedures in our example, right? If we only measured cognitive ability, we wouldn't know anything about whether people were capable of working with others, rescuing people, or driving a truck. So, they would be critically lacking in the ability to perform this job, wouldn't they? When we study individual differences, there are several assumptions that we need to make in order to go forward with our studies. First, we have to accept that adults have a lot of stable attributes. If they weren't stable, it leads to our second point, because we couldn't reliably measure them, right? Which we just learned about in our last lecture. Third, we accept that people are different with regard to all of these attributes. Next, we accept that different jobs require different attributes. After that, we assume that the relative differences between people on these attributes remain after training or different jobs or life experiences. For example, if a person has less knowledge than someone else before they go through a particular training, we assume that even though they both go through training, those differences should still be the same. And finally, we assume that the differences in these attributes are related to job success. If not, we wouldn't even care.